Great, so welcome to the webinar, introducing panLab 2. I'm Dan Higgett, and I know some of you already, so it's really nice to see some familiar faces, and welcome to everyone I don't know. I'm Dan, and my brother Oscar is on the call as well. Oscar's a quantum physicist, so he's the clever one, and he's designed the algorithm that underpins all of the functionality within panLab 2. I'm a life science engineer and software developer, and I've sort of put the icing on top and integrated that functionality into an actual application, and obviously created all the integration with QLab and all the rest of it. So in this meeting today, we're going to start by having a look at some of the panLab 2 concepts, so some of the terminology like maps, zones, and speakers. And we're going to move on to some practical uses of the software, so how to tune your system whilst integrating panLab 2, and then sort of your sound design workflow using the software. And we'll move on to some more advanced functionalities such as dynamic spatialization, which is moving a sound around a space and automating that movement with panLab 2, and some more advanced functionality that's sort of just been introduced really in the second version of panLab, such as derived outputs, which is our way of dealing with sort of subsections of a sound system, such as low frequency energy, and some other advanced functionality as well. That will probably last about 45 minutes, and we'll move on to a bit of a Q&A at the end. So if you've got any questions during the presentation, just write them in the chat. Oscar's going to be monitoring the chat, and at the end of the presentation, he'll kind of read out some of the questions. So yeah, if you've got any questions, just drop it into the chat as we go. So what is panLab? It's a spatial audio mixing solution which is designed to integrate seamlessly with QLab. We've really designed the software from the ground up to be really incredibly quick to set up and simple to use. So, you know, the whole thought process behind it is I really wanted people to be able to boot the software up and be up and running with spatial audio in kind of under 5 minutes. And that could count even if it was like the first time you'd used the software. That was sort of our design requirement, as it were. And it's the only spatial audio solution that's available that doesn't require any additional hardware or software to be running during performances. So you don't need a sort of a black box of tricks, which you know, does a bunch of processing live. You don't need an iPad app to be running to run it. It just all of the spatial audio information itself lives entirely within the QLab queues. So so you don't actually need to be running panLab 2 at all during the performances. Only when you want to actually position a sound in a space, you need to be running panLab 2. So let's have a look at some panLab 2 terminology before we kind of boot up the software and start having a look at it. So we're all on the same page. So you create a panLab 2 file, which exists along all the other files within your production, so your QLab workspace and everything else to do with your production. And that file contains multiple maps. Now, a map, well, it can contain multiple maps, but for the most part, in a theatrical environment, you probably only need to use one map at a time. A map is basically an entire system. So it could be your entire auditorium worth of sound system, worth of loudspeakers, for example, including, you know, all your speakers on stage, all your speakers in the auditorium. A map is basically everything. If you're designing for a sort of an immersive environment or an escape room or something like that, and you've got multiple different rooms, you might want to have a map for each individual room. But for the most part, and as far as this demo is concerned, we're just going to be working with one map. So a map contains all the objects in the panner, which is essentially just your speakers and your QLab queues. Speakers within the map organize into zones. A zone you can think of as a set of speakers that you'd like to pan a sound around. So take an example of the front of house area of an auditorium. So everything, the audience side of the proscenium would be a zone, for example. So you've got a bunch of speakers there that you want to pan a sound around. So you've got your proscenium speakers and you've got your surround loudspeakers. That would be a zone. But a zone is basically any set of speakers that you want to pan a sound around when you pan between a speaker and a central point would be a zone. You could also think of a zone as a kind of polygon shape with each speaker representing a point on the polygon. And we actually visualize the zones within panLab so you can see what I mean by that in terms of the shape of a zone. And finally, think of a zone as a layer of paint on a canvas. So if you're looking at a painting, you're looking at a load of layers of paint. And when you're viewing the painting, you're only looking at the topmost layer of paint. There's a bunch of stuff underneath. And a zone is essentially a layer of paint on the canvas. You only hear audio that's distributed to the topmost zone in the space, but you can have layers of zones and those interactions of zones behind them. So we'll examine that a little bit closer later. And speakers, they just represent QLab Q outputs. So a speaker name just needs to match, the actual name needs to match the name of a QLab Q output, and you create a link, and that's all that the speaker is, essentially. So with that out of the way, let's just have a look at building a map and just starting the demo off. So on the left, we've basically got a QLab 4 workspace. This is a show that I designed a couple of months ago for drama school. I basically stripped everything out of it, apart from the audio cues, which are organized into groups. I've taken all the levels out, and we've got some cross points, and I've named the QLab Q outputs along the bottom. And on the right of the screen, we've got the latest version of panLab 2. So panLab 2 itself doesn't need to be running on the same computer as QLab. It will be for this demo, just to make things easier, but it basically needs to, it communicates with QLab over the network. And so you'll be able to discover and link to any available QLab workspace on the network. And they should all pop up in a nice list here. So I've only got one here, the webinar demo. But you just hit connect and link, and you've basically created a connection between that workspace and panLab 2. So you're presented, when you first create a new panLab 2 file, you're presented with the opportunity to create your first map, because you'll need a map in order to position anything onto the panel. So we're going to create a map today called Auditorium. And that's this map is basically going to contain all of our loudspeakers that we're going to be dealing with. And then you're prompted to create your first zone. So let's create a zone called front of house, which is going to contain all of our front of house loudspeakers. And then we actually need to add the speakers themselves. So we just click this add speaker button here. And if you're running a relatively modern version of QLab, I think it's anything over 4.6, panLab 2 is actually able to pull all of your QLab Q output names into a list. So you don't need to type them out anymore. And you are basically presented with a speaker in this list. So let's just add some loudspeakers for all of my loudspeakers in front of the cross. And then to actually position on the panel, it's all drag and drop in panLab. So we just drag and drop a speaker onto the panel, and you'll see that we start getting this visualization turning up on the panLab panel. So drag these in. So just like that, we've created our first zone. The other thing we need to add to the zone is a sound source itself. So we've got, let's just show you all the panels actually whilst we're here. panLab 2 is divided into 3 panels. We've got the central panel, which is the panel itself, the left-hand side panel, which is the selected QLab cues in QLab, and essentially all the objects in the panel. And the right-hand panel is the inspector window of the currently selected cue in the panel. So let's just shut down that right-hand side panel for the minute. Let's to a point where I can resize it. So this cue is selected in QLab, and so it's in our list here. So if I drag and drop it onto the panel, you'll see that immediately we've started updating our QLab Q output levels. As I drag the cue to the front of the panel, we're panning between pros left and pros right. And as I move the sound around the panel, we're panning between to the side surround and to the rear surround. And I bring the cue back into the middle, and we're right sort of central again. Within the zone itself, the total amount of output power is normalized to a set level. You can control that level using this little mixer interface here. So I've got it to default, and you can set this up in preferences to output a -20 when you first drag a cue in. You can set that up yourself, and as you see, as I make that cue louder or quieter, the overall level control changes in QLab. So let's just set that back to -20. for now. So that was it. With those sort of few clicks of the mouse, we've got a sort of a fairly complicated 6-point panner panning around our entire front of house sound system. But we want to be able to sort of spatialize a sound not only over the auditorium area, but also move that sound onto stage as well. So for that, we're going to create a second zone. So we're going to hit this add zone button here. I'm going to call this zone stage. And I'm going to add my 4 on-stage loudspeakers in this case, and drag them onto the panner. And you'll see that panLab is actually just picked a new color for this zone. You get a random color when you assign the zone, but these two look quite nice together. You'll see we've got this visualization here, and this visualization is showing you how the amplitude is mapped between the zones and around the panner. So you'll see that the front of house zone at the moment is the topmost zone. So it overlaps above the blue stage zone. If I change that order here, you'll see that the blue stage zone now takes priority over the front of house zone. So you can see in real time, with the visualization actually uses the same algorithm that we use for processing the audio. So that's a sort of a fairly pixel accurate representation of how the sound is going to be distributed between the two zones. You'll see I talked about the zone itself being a shape. If I adjust the boundary of the zone to be really small, you'll see what I mean by that. So this is the shape of the zone. Now, because I've made the boundary of the zone really small, we don't get that fade out as we move away from the zone. So actually, let's demonstrate that first. So if I give you a bit of a boundary and move this sound out of the zone, you'll see that as I move out of the zone, the sound fades out of the system. If you're looking at the QLab Q outputs, so we can control the transition between zones. If I just to demo, if I make that shape really small, now we've got a really hard cutoff. So we're at full power and we move out of the zone, and the sound just drops out of the system. So that this zone boundary here is how we manage the transition between zones. So if I sort of set that up to be a slightly more realistic size for both these zones, you can see that we can now create crossfades between the front of house zone and the stage. So if you have a look at, if I just close the zone manager here, if you have a look now, you'll see that as we move the sound from the proscenium onto the stage, the sound is transitioning onto the stage there. So we've got this smooth transition between the two zones. So that kind of brings me on to the next sort of section of the demo, which is how to tune a system whilst using panLab 2. So what we want to do, as I said, panLab 2 normalizes the output level within a zone, and it'll actually normalize the output level between zones as well. So as long as you've got enough of an overlap, the total amount of output power between zones is going to be normalized to that same constant output level. So in terms of tuning your sound system, you're going to want to start by using panLab probably to actually listen to a piece of audio and move it around your zones that you've set up, and try and make sure that you've got an equal amount of output power as you move the sound around the zone. If you find that you've got a sort of a 5 dB difference between your proscenium system and your side surrounds, that's going to be noticeable when you're panning the sound between those loudspeakers. So I'd sort of strongly suggest that you start by using a gain stage sort of further up the signal chain than panLab to even out the amount of output power between all of your sounds, your speakers in your sound system, wherever you might want to do that. And then once you're happy with that, we can continue using panLab. panLab itself is able to create offsets for speakers. So you've got this extra gain stage in the sort of panLab process where we can add. So if I move this up a bit, so if we look at side surround left, I can turn up the overall output level to side surround left with this slider here, or down. And that's so sort of a global offset. After the processing and the algorithm and everything, after all of that, we could just add a few decibels or take them away from a loudspeaker if you wish. So that's quite a useful feature, but I'd really try and suggest that you do that elsewhere first if you can, because there's only sort of a 60 or 70 dB dynamic range within the faders in QLab. So you're limiting the dynamic range of your panner if you use that, if you lean too heavily on that feature, if you don't need to. So once you're happy with the overall distribution of audio within your sound system, I'd suggest that you lock the zone, which you can do with this little lock icon up at the top of the screen here. If we hit that lock icon, everything within the zone is, everything within the map now, so we're locking the map, sorry, not the zone. Everything within the map is now grayed out, and we can't make any adjustments to it. And we can't also move these speakers. I'm just clicking on cross left here. I can't move that now on the panner accidentally. So we've kind of locked down the spatial audio environment. And now the only thing that we can move on the panner is the QLab queue itself. So that's quite a neat way of working. If you can tune your system first and then come back to add the rest of your audio later, that's quite a smooth way of working with panLab 2. So moving on now to actually integrating panLab 2 into your sound design workflow. Well, basically panLab 2 works with a sort of, it works with cue selection. So if we select a bunch of cues in QLab, so let's select all of the 3 cues within this group. What we can do in panLab is hit this fetch selected cues button. That will then fetch whatever audio cues are selected within QLab. And we now have the option to drag and drop these cues from this list onto the panner. So I'll just go ahead and do that. So let's drag a sound on stage and another sound into the auditorium. And now we have control over the position and level of all these 3 sounds within panLab. So that's sort of how you'd work. You'd find some sounds you want to position. You select them. You click this button, and we see them turning up in the panner or in this list, and then you drag them into the panner if you haven't added them yet. So when you're working with a sound, if you select it, so when you make a selection within the panner, you'll see that you get this second ring around the sounds, around the object in the panner. You also get the object highlighted blue in this list on the left. And if we have the right-hand side panel open, we also see the sound turn up in this right-hand panel. So if I deselect everything, we've got nothing in that panel. And as I select a sound, it turns up in that panel. This is the selected cue. That's what we're referring to in panLab as the selected cue. And we've got some QLab remote control functionality that we can use to be able to play back that sound from panLab. So if you have a look at the menu up the top here, the QLab remote menu, we can select, preview, stop, or pause the current cue, sorry, not the selected cue, the current cue. And we've got keyboard shortcuts as well, which are familiar to QLab users. So if you hit V on the keyboard, for example, you'll preview the current cue in QLab. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I hit V on the keyboard, you'll see that that sound is playing in QLab now, and we can position it and hear it as we move it on the panel. Another option is we can actually control click and preview the parent group of that sound. So if I stop that sound, if I control V on the selected cue, we're now previewing the whole group of sounds that cue is a part of, if you want to do that. So that's a way of sort of speeding up the workflow from working just within panLab. And actually hit Control S to stop all those. Another thing another sort of a trick up panLab's sleeve to make your life a little bit easier as you're working is that panLab can also be remotely controlled itself by OSC, the Open Sound Control. So one use case for that would be to sort of remotely press this fetch selected audio cues button. So if you want to sort of streamline that workflow even more, the only slightly fiddly thing that you might want to set up in your QLab workspace would be a remote button, a remote way of pressing this fetch selected audio cues button. And in this workspace here, I've got this in a separate cue list. This is the OSC command. In fact, if you go to our website, Innovate Audio, if I just pull this up here, it's all documented. The OSC dictionary is documented. So the first thing in the dictionary, in fact, one of the most useful things that I find is this fetch cues OSC command that you can pull up, which is this. And the advantage of doing this is I can create a hotkey trigger for this event. So now when I press the number 1 button in QLab, I'm essentially remotely pressing this fetch selected audio cues button. So if I jump back to my main cue list and close down that window to make it clearer. So if I highlight a cue and press the number 1 on the keyboard, you'll see that we've now jumped to just display this particular cue because it's the selected cue in panLab. So we can be working away, press number 1, and then just go over to panLab and start adjusting that audio or changing the level of that audio or whatever you wanted to do. So that's another little way that you can streamline the connection between these two pieces of software. Whilst I'm here, I forgot to point this out last week, and over the last few weeks, people have emailed me just to ask this question. There's a panLab 2 preferences window that you can find from the main menu. So as I mentioned before, I've got some default levels set up. So just like default levels in QLab, you can set a default level that you want to import new cues to, default fade duration, and all sorts of other defaults that you might want to change in there as well. So that was just whilst I remembered that. So let's move on now to some slightly more advanced functionality. And I'm just going to pull up the slideshow again. I'm going to start talking about sequences, which is how we automate the movement of sound around the space, sort of dynamic spatialization. So I mentioned at the start of the demo that panLab 2 is the only, as far as I know, the only spatial audio solution on the market that doesn't require any additional hardware or software to be run during performances. So in order to actually move a sound around a space without requiring panLab 2 to be run, panLab 2 actually creates sequences, and a sequence is essentially a group cue, and that group cue contains a series of QLab fade cues, and each fade cue represents a point on the panel that we can draw onto the panel. And then when you play back that group cue in QLab, you'll hear the effect of the sound moving around the space without our software actually having to be run at the time, which is kind of neat. So let's demo that for you guys now. So let's show the right panel now instead of the left panel. So if I was to select this cue in panLab, let's just move it to the pros left, pretty much. You'll see that I've got this selection on the right panel, and it tells us which cue we're working with. It gives us a level control, but underneath all of that, we can create a set of sequences for this cue. The sequence itself is created when we press this button at whatever point the playhead is currently in QLab. So if I go ahead and click this Create Sequence button, you'll see that at the current playhead in QLab, we've got a new group cue with a fade cue, and the group cue is called New Sequence. Let's rename that Pan Around Auditorium, which is renamed the group cue as well. And let's move this first fade somewhere sensible. And we can create this sequence by simply clicking this Draw Path button in panLab, and we're prompted to move this object in the panner around to record the automation. So let's go ahead and do that. As you'll see, as we start moving the sound around, we're dropping new points onto the panner at regular intervals. If I release the mouse, all those points turn out to be fade cues, which are then copied into the QLab workspace at that point. And if we were to replay this automation now, you would get the effect of this sound moving around. So just to make it really clear, let's move fade 4 right next to rear surround left. What fade was that for? And have a look at those audio levels. You'll see that we're mostly panned to rear surround left for that fade. So you'll see that those fades are all positioned individually within your sound system. So that's kind of a neat feature. Let's just this one because we're going to know the game. If I was to be playing back this sound as I'm recording the audio, let's just show you this. Let's just leave this as new sequence now and select it and move this over here. And let's make that first fade 0.1 seconds. If I'm to draw this automation path now, you'll see that we start drawing the automation at 23, 24 seconds into the recording. As I move this, as I record the automation now, let's just move it somewhere else, you'll see that because we were listening to the audio as we were recording the automation, panLab has also in the background just recorded the point in the original audio that we were at when we started recording the automation. And it's offering us the ability to create an offset in the timing of the sequence to match where we were in the original recording when we started recording the sequence. So that when you played those two cues back at exactly the same point in time as part of a group, for example, your automation would sound exactly the same as when you first recorded it. So if I hit OK on that, you'll see that panLab has put in a 24-second pre-wait into that sequence for us. So if I was to play back this entire group together, that sound would sound, the movement of that sound would match the timing of the cue that we recorded it in. So that's another feature that you can use in panLab 2. Another thing that quite commonly happens is you record this beautiful sequence of movement and the director comes back and goes, that's great, but can we knock 5 seconds off the sequence? So we can do that with panLab 2 again. So if we use this set total duration button down at the bottom here, if I type in, oh, so I see, yes, the sequence is 8 seconds long. So let's make it 10 seconds long. Let's make it a little bit longer on this case. And we can adjust the length of the sequence either by resetting it so we maintain a constant speed of movement around the panel if you wanted to do that, or more likely you might want to adjust the speed proportionally. So the speed will happen a bit slower now because it's 10 seconds instead of 8 seconds. But the speed of movement between each of these points is going to be maintained. The proportionality of it is going to be maintained. So let's press that button. You'll see that this sequence is now 10 seconds long, and all of these fade times essentially have got that little bit longer to make up for that. So by default, when you record a sequence, the overall normalized level of that sequence is locked to the overall normalized level of the source sounds. So as you move the sound around the panner, you're not actually changing the level of the sound relative to the rest of the panner, but you are just moving it. So by default, we've got this little checkbox down here, which is lock levels to source, which means that if I have a look at, say, fade 4, for example, if I change the source level, you'll see that the fade 4 levels jump up and down as I'm moving the source level around, because those two normalized levels are locked together. There may be times when that's not desirable and you actually want to unlink those two properties. And if we unclick lock levels to source, you'll see that we get individual faders, individual mixers for each fade within the sequence. So now if I go to fade 4 in here and click the little mixer, at the moment it's at -8 because the original's at -8, but I've got the option to turn that up or down on an individual fade basis, should you want the fade, the sound of the audio to jump up and down as it moves around the panel. And if we check that box back again, the level will be jumped back to -8. So that is another feature of sequences. If I was to accidentally delete some of these, wrong button. If I was to accidentally delete some of these fades in QLab, panLab keeps track of all that. So you'll see that we get these little warning triangles, which is warning us that the fades don't currently exist in QLab, and we can resync them back whenever we want to match up again the data in QLab with the data in panLab, should you ever accidentally delete any of that data from QLab. If we delete those fades from panLab, so let's delete fade 13, that is all copied across to QLab. It's all kept in sync. Great. So that is a recap of sequences. So let's move on now to some other more advanced functionality of panLab 2, which are derived outputs, which I've got another slide for. So a derived output is an additional QLab Q output where the level we're sending that we can send a level to, and the level we're sending to that additional QLab Q output is derived from the level we're sending to a selection of other outputs that we can pick. It's useful for managing sends to other subsystems. So we all know that our beautiful PA system is actually made up of a whole bunch of other subsystems, front fills, delays, all the rest of it. I was really thinking of the LFE component of a sound system when I put this feature together. That's really what I had in mind, but there's some other use cases as well that you could use it for. So let's set up a derived output to demo that functionality and explain what it's all about. So we're going to use, let's just have that in the panel, it doesn't really matter. So in QLab, hiding from view, I've got an additional output called subs that I'd like to send some level to in certain circumstances. So if I load up my map manager, which is my way of managing the map, and if I unlock it in order to make changes and add a derived output, you'll see that we've got this assign derived outputs button. And for every map in the sound system, we can have 8 derived outputs assigned to that map. So let's create a derived output called LFE. So the first column here is the derived output name. This is just a descriptive name that you can use to reference it in panLab. The second column is the route to QLab Q output column. This is a bit like a speaker output. The name of it needs to exactly match the QLab Q output you want it to refer to. So in this case, we're going to call it subs. And the third column is allows us to create a selection of which outputs we'd like to derive this output level from. So for this one, for our subs, we're going to derive it from the level we're sending to all of our front of house loudspeakers. Hit done. And now, if I close down the map manager, you'll see that in our list, in our mixer here, we've got our 8 derived outputs, and the first one is labeled LFE. Now, from this point on, you can think of a derived output like a post-fade auxiliary send on a mixing desk. So if I was to turn this send up to 0, because our sound is within the front of house zone, you'll see that our subs output has also jumped out to -8 dB because it's post-fade in relation to the max level, as it were. So now, as I move my sound around the front of house PA system, you'll see that our subs output level is locked to -8 because it's derived from all of the loudspeakers within this zone. If I move this sound outside the zone, you'll see that the level we're sending to the subs diminishes along with the level we're sending to the rest of the zone. If I move our sound outside the zone onto the stage, again, the level we're sending to the subs diminishes because we're not deriving this output level from any of our on-stage speakers. So that's pretty cool. Another thing we can do is make this a little bit more complicated. Let's say we've got some rear subs as well. So we've got another output here, which is rear subs. So let's move the sound back up to the front. If we go to our map manager and we assign another derived output, let's call this one rear LFE. And the output that we want to get to is rear subs. Now for this output, we're going to derive it from the level we're sending to all of our surround loudspeakers. And we're going to change our main LFE output to be assigned to be derived from just the level we're sending to our proscenium loudspeakers. And we'll close that down. And again, we've now got this second derived output open up in our mixer. And let's just turn that up to 0 to make the demo really clear. So now you see we're still just sending to our subs because we're at the front. We're only panning to pros left and right. But as we move the sound back through the zone, we're creating a crossfade essentially between the sub and the rear subs output. So we can control how we're distributing that LFE in that way as well. So we've got a bunch of other more advanced functionality. One thing I want to highlight which is really something that I built into this software with theatrical sound designers in mind. Let's move this out here to make this quite clear. So we're going to just send this output level pretty much just to the side surround left. So this feature is really being dreamed up for the the example of designing a production in your first venue of a tour, and you've got your main pros, you've got your side surrounds, and you've got your rear surrounds. 3 venues into the tour, we meet a venue where there's nowhere to hang side surround speakers. How do we deal with that with our panLab map? Well, we've got this extra bit of functionality built into the map, which allows us to deactivate loudspeakers, which is useful for this very scenario. So if I deactivate our side surround loudspeakers and have a look at what that's done to our QLab Q outputs, instead of distributing that level to the side surround, it's now switched side surround off, and it's redistributed that audio level to the pros left and the rear surround left pretty equally, because it's just imagining that this side surround loudspeaker doesn't exist, and now this is just a panner between pros left and rear surround left. And as we move the sound, we're now just panning between cross left and rear surround left on this side. Switch those outputs back on, and we're back to normal, and we've redistributed that audio again. So that's another piece of advanced functionality that I can demo. And that sort of brings us to the end of the presentation today. What we can do now, if we like, is Oscar, if we've got any questions in the chat.
Sure, yeah, there are a few questions. So Matt has asked, how does panLab know where loudspeakers are aimed, or does that matter?
It doesn't really matter. Oh, it matters. I mean, you kind of know where your loudspeakers are aimed, and so it's a great question. But we're really thinking of each individual zone as being a set of speakers around a listening position. And so you want the listener to be within your map somewhere. And it's up to you to create your zones in such a way that they would make sense in that regard. So think of each zone as a set of speakers you'd want to pan a sound around, and your listener will be in there somewhere. If you've pointed your speaker off into in a different direction, it might be that it actually needs to be part of a different zone, if that's a problem for you. But yeah, good question.
And then there's another question from Matt, which is, how does one import a ground plan?
Okay, yeah, good question. So I don't have a ground plan for this particular setup, but we've got a background image that is available behind each map. If we click the little folder icon, I think I've got, if I just type in plan, I think it's just a generic image that I've been using somewhere. Here we are, that I used on something else. So the plan itself just needs to be, well, it'll be aligned to be square. It needs to fit inside the panel, which is square. So behind your map, you can put a ground plan, and we can actually fade the opacity of the visualization, so to allow you to overlay that quite nicely behind the ground plan. So obviously that ground plan isn't any relation to those speakers, but you could imagine that you could place all of your loudspeakers on the ground plan itself, and then you get that the visualization overlaid over the top of it.
Okay, and then another final question from Matt is, how does panLab know the physical distance between sources?
That's a good question. It doesn't, and it doesn't really matter for our algorithm. What matters is the relationship between the loudspeakers. The physical distances, we're not dealing with delay times, it's a purely level-based panning. So what matters is that a zone is a set of speakers around a central position that you want to pan a sound around. The algorithm itself works by working out, if you imagine this green zone here is a clock face, and these are all hours on the clock. basically when you position a sound within that zone, panLab behind the scenes is looking around the clock face, clockwise and anti-clockwise, and working out the sort of angle distance differences between these the closest two loudspeakers, and distributing the audio accordingly. It doesn't matter if they could be 100 meters apart or 20 meters apart or 5 meters, it doesn't matter. That's still the two closest speakers.
Okay, and then a question from Paul is, do QLab volume limits need to be set to +12 or -60, or can they be, for example, +12, -100?
No, they can be whatever you want them to be. Just trying to think. I always leave them at whatever the standard is, but I think panLab goes down to -100 from memory. So it'll work down to -100s in terms of the normalized level. It would actually probably go further because the algorithm will then work out it would then output even lower than -100 if you wanted to, I believe. But in terms of a normalized level that you're normalizing to, I think -100 is the lowest.
Okay, and another question from Paul is, could you explain a bit more about why you need more than one zone in a theatre?
Yeah, great question. So so a zone is a set of speakers you want to pan a sound around. So in this example here, because we're working on angles, if this was all one zone, essentially the middle of the zone would probably be about where that sound is now. And so you'd pan, in this example, you'd pan the sound between cross left, and it'd probably go into your downstage, upstage loudspeakers and across the other side of your stage before hitting cross right. So you would never be able, if you had that all as one zone, you'd never be able to pan a sound just between cross left and cross right. It might be that that's what you want, and there's nothing wrong with that, but that would be the limitation of it. You'd never be able to go, I just want this sound to be dead center down the cross and not on stage, for example. You'd be panning between cross left and through your on-stage loudspeakers before you got to cross right.
Okay, and then another question from Paul is, can you talk a bit about how panLab 2 deals with stereo files as you move sounds around?
Yeah, so we basically respect the cross points that you've put into QLab. So this is a stereo file, and when we're sending to cross left, we're using the left-hand side of the file, and when we're moving to cross right, we're listening to the right-hand side of the file. So it's really in a way it respects it, in a way it doesn't respect it. It doesn't change anything. It just respects what you've got your cross points as. I mean, some would argue that spatial audio works best with mono files because you're not worrying about that. In my experience of using panLab, that has worked quite well, setting up my cross points as if they were stereo files routed to your left or right loudspeakers.
And presumably if you just change your cross points in QLab, then it's just moving those faders.
Exactly. All that panLab does is move the actual output faders themselves. It doesn't even adjust the master level, which is quite useful because it means that you've got another level control somewhere else. So I had someone email me the other day to ask about how if we were moving a sound, moving, I think they used the example of a buzzing bee that had some dialogue, and it was buzzing, it was moving around, and the dialogue needs to drop in and out. One way of doing that in that example was you'd then create further automation in QLab that would automate your master volume of your sound that was moving around. So yeah, the only things that panLab 2 will affect in QLab is the level faders of any speakers that you've got anywhere in your map. Anything that you've imported in.
Great, and then you got a question from Tony, which is, can you mirror a sequence move to another cue? So having two sources mirror each other.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's something that came up last week, and it's something that I'm going to build. It's on the roadmap. It's essentially would be a sequence library. So you'd have a separate screen that you'd be able to drag sequences into and then basically drag them onto other cues. At the moment, it doesn't exist, I'm afraid, but that is definitely sort of the next, 2.1, whenever that comes out soon. Hopefully, we'll have a library feature that you'd be able to drag those onto. At the moment, you'll have to do that manually, or you could copy and paste the group queue in QLab and reassign the target, but which isn't a particularly neat way of doing it. When I need to do that at the moment, I'm just doing it manually.
Cool. I mean, so when I say mirror, so if you had something moving from upstage left to downstage left, cross right, surround right, you've got one queue that's doing that. Again, you didn't have another queue that's doing a separate source doing the same thing on the other side.
On the other side of the stage, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, right, in a different place. Yeah, so you probably...
So it's doing the same movement, but one's you got, say, for instance, a B on auditorium left, moving down auditorium left side, and you've got a dog barking on the other side doing the same move at the same time.
Right, I've got you. Sorry, I misunderstood your question slightly. Same thing applies. So you'd probably just create two sequences. You could then use the set total duration function to kind of lock those two durations together. And you probably, in QLab itself, you probably just put those in, both those sequences into a group queue and run them at the same time. Would be my solution for that. Cool. Nice.
Okay, and next question is from Paul. So how do you get around deactivating speakers which are critical? Can you reroute more than one output from QLab to a single panLab 2 output?
I don't actually fully understand the question.
Okay, so
I
like the, I mean, I love the idea that if you move to a venue where you can't use your side surround speakers, you just deactivate them. But what happens if in QLab, there's some really important stuff that you're sending to those speakers? You've now just muted them. So say it's a voiceover that has a specific line. So is there a way without changing anything in QLab that you can still hear that?
Sure. Okay, that's a great question. So when I say deactivating speakers, I'm not actually changing any cues that, first of all, it doesn't deactivate the entire output in relation to anything else that you've got routed to it. So if you've got a queue in QLab that hasn't been put into panLab, it leaves that queue alone, it doesn't know about it. So that's first off. Second of all, so if you do have if you've got a sound that you've put into your map in panLab and it goes to that loudspeaker and it's really critical that you hear it, but that's kind of what the deactivating the loudspeaker does, because that loudspeaker doesn't exist, that output's not going anywhere, it's rerouting that audio to the nearest available outputs whilst keeping the normalized level the same. So essentially you'll get the nearest possible representation of what that sounded like when it was there.
Okay, great. Yeah, I misunderstood what deactivation meant, but that's great.
Cool. Yeah. So and it kind of works best. I've really designed panLab 2, and the way I try and use it is to put all of my audio into it. And a feature like that works best if you did put all of your audio in, because then it would affect all of the audio in QLab. If you only use it with some cues, then you need to take that into account and rework all of the non-panLab 2 related sounds.
So when you say you put all your audio, you're basically doing all your positional routing, even if it's static in panLab.
Exactly, yeah. So it's a personal preference. So the beauty of it is it lives completely above QLab, and you can use it for whatever you want. You could use it for one queue, or you could use it for all your queues. In the obviously we've only just got back to working, and we've only created this thing recently, but I've just done a sound design in a drama school where every single piece of audio, instead of I never sort of touched a QLab output fader, for example. Every single piece of audio I wanted to route, I'd just drag it into panLab and position it and level it that way. And in that situation where you've completely changed your workflow to doing everything in panLab, then panLab can go and do these extra things like deactivating speakers, for example. But it's a total personal preference. The thing about panLab is that it doesn't change the rest of your workflow in any way. So if you just have a few cues that you want to use it for, then that's fine. And if you want to use it for everything, then that's fine too.
Okay, there's a question from Fabian, who's just asking if we can, if people can get the recording of the demo.
Of this, yeah, sure. Yeah, I've had a few people who can make it tonight asking for recordings. So as long as everyone's happy with that, and feel free to not be, I'm happy to release that.
Great, and then Tom has asked, is there a straightforward way to map height? How would you conceptualize speakers that are directly above each other?
Cool, that is a great question. So at the moment, panLab 2 maps are, as I mentioned, they're layers of paint on a canvas. So each zone is a layer of paint. So you can create height by adding a zone above another zone. So say we had an overhead loudspeaker in the middle. I don't actually have an output called overhead, so it's going to warn me about it. But if I created another zone, and let's change the color to reds, which I've just done slightly off screen, and let's create an output called overhead. It's going to give me a warning because that name's not found in the workspace. If I was to put that on top of our front of house zone, now if we move to the center, we're routing that, that sound's going to transition into the overhead. So you've kind of created that height that way. But in general, this doesn't particularly deal with some of the Z axis, as it were. It's really kind of a flat map at the moment. But you can, as I say, by putting layers on top of layers and overlaying them like that, you can move a sound up into an upper speaker just by where it's positioned on the map, should you wish to.
And could you sorry, if this is a bit dim, but could you move either from left to right or up and down fairly straightforwardly?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So another feature for the roadmap will be to be able to essentially change the overall opacity of a zone. So on a Q by Q basis. So at the moment, Qs, when you put them on the map, are kind of distributed to all the zones equally. There's one panner essentially. But another piece of functionality that I've got on the roadmap is essentially it will be in your mixer here, as well as having all your output levels, your derived output levels. You'll also have all of your zones and how much of opacity you want to give that zone. So if you had that example of an overhead being positioned above another zone, you could then, by changing the opacity, be then changing how high it was on the map, if that makes sense.
You could stick the opacity on a fade as well?
Yeah, you would be able to, yeah. This isn't something that exists at the moment. That's like, this is a few months down the line, basically.
Can't wait. Thank you.
No worries.
Okay, next question is from Ian, who asks, is it possible to make a sequence that varies in speed? For example, a slow fade across front of house, left and right, and then a sudden spin around the surrounds?
Absolutely. So, sorry, I didn't explain that quite as clearly in terms of what's actually going on. When you create a fade, when you draw a fade on, like I did before, there are two things that panLab's recording. So let's do this again. First of all, it's recording where the mouse point is within the panner, and also it's recording how long it's taken to get between all of those points. So you'll see I'm going around really slowly now up to fade 10, and let's just zoom across through to up to fade 7, and let's move across really quickly up to fade 14. So you'll see that these first fades are all like a second long, and the last few fades are all like 0.22 of a second, so 200 milliseconds. And that's because as I'm recording that movement, it's recording not only where my mouse is, but also how quickly it's got there. So yes, it does that out of the box.
Okay, and then a question from Jonathan is, can you overlay zones? So for example, add a third zone to your map that includes all the speakers for some cues, but using the two zones you already have for other cues.
Yeah, so that sort of comes back to the point I made before, which is a piece of functionality that we're going to be building in and hopefully the next major release, which will be basically, yeah, so changing which zones any given sound is going to be routed to. So it'll be its own sort of a zone mixer, as it were, where you can go. So if you had, so the example of another overhead zone above your main panner, you could change how that audio is distributed between the main cross and surround speakers and your overhead loudspeakers, and that will essentially change the height, because you're changing essentially the opacity of the zone on the image, on as part the opacity of the layer of paint on the painting would be the analogy. Yeah,
I think that's all the questions.
Great. Any other question that people have got as I've rattled through those? No. Fantastic. Well, look, I'm really honoured that you guys have all come along to the webinar. Thank you so much for giving up this lovely sunny evening to come and watch us have a chat. And it's been really nice to see lots of friendly faces on the screen after not seeing people in person for so long. So thank you so much for coming along.
Thanks, Dan. Brilliant bit of software, mate.
Thanks,
Thank you
Dan. Good
much.
work.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks
Nice
very
one.
much. Top man.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.